Well, the public is angry. Okay.
What are they angry about?
What?
What are they angry about?
Let's put that aside for the moment. The key thing is, it is angry. That's demonstrable. Why? It's problematic. Okay. And being angry at the institutions of government and the institutions of society, it wants to strike at them. Being divided, it can't unify, it can't mobilize, it except in the act of repudiation. So what you find is these groups like, and if you are in a country like Egypt, well, you're repudiating Hosni Mubarak, right? So that's not a bad thing to be repudiating. But you're in Chile, and 2019, you're repudiating democracy and capitalism and everything that has made that country prosperous and free for the last 25 years, right? It seems to make no difference between dictatorships and democracies, very healthy democracies like Chile's. It's a repudiation of modern government as such. And because the public is so fractured, it can't put forward an alternative vision. When a vision is put forward, immediately things begin to disintegrate. The crowd in Tahrir Square could overthrow Mubarak, but if you looked at that crowd and you analyze who was there, you had socialists, you had normal Egyptians who were mildly religious, you had the Muslim Brotherhood youth, you had all kinds of activist groups. If you had asked them, okay, now you've overthrown Mubarak, so now what do? They would have disintegrated into a babel of hostile voices. So what happened in Egypt? Well, first the Muslim Brotherhood took over, and then the Egyptian army, two very old-fashioned hierarchical institutions, swept aside the public and all that babel of voices. So that's the one phenomenon, the rise of the public made possible entirely by digital platforms. The other one is what I call the crisis of authority, which is that our institutions, our 20th century institutions, essentially were constructed in that old era that I happened to participate in, that I was telling you about, where information was very thin on the ground. And these institutions sort of had a semi-monopoly of the flow of information. And it turns out that without that semi-monopoly, they go into crisis. They lapse into crisis. They lose their legitimacy in the eyes of the public. In the old days, government would say things. I mean, one of my favorite examples is LBJ basically sends a bunch of Cubans and the anti-Castro Cubans into the Bay of Pigs. A strange decision, disastrous. So it's very early in his administration.
Oh, you mean JFK, not LBJ, correct?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, JFK. Yeah, John F. Kennedy sends this mini invasion of Cuba that ends in a disaster within a few days. That was CIA organized for sure, and it was his decision, and he made it. It was a bad decision, and he stood up and said, "Well, I am the responsible party." Those are his words. And the next day, the poll said that his popularity had increased by like 10%, and trust in government was like at 80%. Okay, those were the old days. They controlled the narrative. The story was pretty much in the hands of the elites who control the institutions. Today, the elites are essentially in a state of panic, and the story is their failure. Elite failure. It pretty much sets the information agenda. So we know every misjudgment that is made by politicians or by actors, or every failed prediction, every self-interested move that ends with money in your hands, every sexual escapade, every disgraceful thing that happens is known, exposed, and talked about endlessly. So we have this hemorrhage of trust in the institutions and hostility towards the elites who manage them. And all that is, I mean, you can just look at the polls. It's empirically demonstrable.
So we had an era in the past in which a few people or a few institutions controlled the information, and they were able to present the information they wanted to the public. But then when the digital age comes, all that is fractured. And so now there isn't one cohesive message. Now everybody with a cell phone or a laptop has the opportunity to put out their own message. And so instead of having a cohesive piece of information, now it's all fractured. And the elites can't control that. So now they are under a crisis of authority. At the same time, the people who have rebelled against it, whether you see that in Tahrir Square or in Occupy Wall Street or in Black Lives Matter or in Chile, like you said, wherever, they all have kind of this common thing in that they're against something, but they can't really figure out what they're for. They each have something they're for. It's just that they don't work together. What binds them together is what they're against. And so that's kind of what we see today, is that institutions are being torn down, that people lack trust in their government, they lack trust in the media, they lack trust in their public health officials, whatever it is. And so I want to unpack all that a little bit more as we talk. Let's go back. So the title of the book is Revolt of the Public, and you said the public isn't the masses. It's this, I guess you're saying, bands of people or groups of people who have an agenda. I'm not exactly sure who the public is, but who is it that they're against?
I took my definition of the public from Walter Lippmann, who was one of the smartest men to write about American society. And it's essentially any group of people who, as Lippmann puts it, is interested in a particular affair. All right. Mm-hmm. And so, they band around a single issue or something strikes them. If you are the yellow vests in France, for example, they raise, and usually you will find that the trigger for these eruptions of the public are not the causes, because the triggers seem very trivial. Emmanuel Macron, president of France, raises the price of diesel fuel by a few pennies. And suddenly he's got people swarming into Paris, vandalizing monuments and burning banks. Okay. That was, if you had looked into that group, the Yellow Vests, they had been gathering on Facebook for months in what they called anger groups, groupe de colère. I love that. And just basically yelling and screaming about Macron and how terrible he was. And somehow those few pennies on diesel fuel was the trigger that sent them into the streets. A very similar thing in Chile. So they basically they gather around some issue, some question, but the impulse is total. Is not just I want this change, and you find that the public will not take yes for an answer. One of the very first things Macron did when this revolt erupted was to reduce the tax on diesel back to the old levels. No, not good enough anymore. That really is not what they're about. They're about battering away at the institutions, battering away at the elites. And obviously, if you are not putting forward an alternative, this can easily become what I call nihilism, which is the belief that destruction is a form of progress.